New Vitamin Water Zero Sugar Pineapple Passion Fruit is packed with vitamins, just like the amount of peas we packed in that sentence. It's packed like your tote bag, the one you stole from your ex, or your overpriced half a studio apartment, or extra rushed rush hour traffic. Packed like your calendar. Triple booked at 5, of course. Grab a vitamin water. Did we mention it's packed with vitamins?
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Alison, and I'm so glad you're here to discover what brings out the best of you. This podcast is all about breaking free from painful patterns, mending the past, and discovering our true selves in God. I can't wait to get started as we learn together how to become the best version of who we are with God's help. Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of The Best of You. I'm so glad you're here with me today for this incredible conversation. Today's episode is for you if you've ever found yourself holding joy at arm's length. Maybe you're fearful of trusting that the good in front of you is real, that it's safe to exhale, or that it might actually last. Maybe you've been through loss, disappointment, or long seasons of waiting. And even when something good finally happens, instead of celebrating, you catch yourself bracing for what might go wrong. Or maybe you've quietly stopped hoping altogether, telling yourself it's easier not to expect anything good at all to happen than to risk being let down one more time. Our guest today knows this feeling well. Nicole Zasowski is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's a speaker, and she's the author of a fantastic book. It's called What If It's Wonderful? Release Your Fears, Choose Joy, and Find the Courage to Celebrate. And she's just released a brand new Bible study. It's called Daring Joy, what 6 women in the Bible teach us about the power of celebration when it feels risky, complicated, and even impossible. What I love about Nicole's work is that she invites us to see joy not as a fleeting feeling, but as a courageous, countercultural practice, one that we can and really must learn how to cultivate no matter our circumstances. Nicole's own journey to joy began in a season marked by change, loss, and a performance-based identity. She shares candidly about walking through infertility and multiple miscarriages and the surprising realization that joy was the most vulnerable emotion she could feel. Because when you hold something dear, there's always the risk of losing it. Instead of avoiding that vulnerability, Nicole began to explore what it looks like to practice joy as a rhythm of life rather than a reaction to circumstances. In today's conversation, we'll talk about the difference between true joy and what you might think of as bright-siding or toxic positivity, why joy can sometimes feel harder to embrace than grief or loss, and really practical ways to retrain your mind to notice, savor, and celebrate the good in your everyday life. I loved this conversation because Nicole brings both the depth of her clinical training and the vulnerability of someone who's wrestled through these questions herself. She gives us permission to honor what's hard and to welcome what's good every single day, reminding us that joy is not for the lucky few, but it's for all of us. So whether you're in a season of sweetness or a season of sorrow, or like most of us, somewhere in the both and, this conversation will give you practical, spiritually rooted, and deeply compassionate tools to start daring joy today. Please enjoy my conversation with Nicole Zasowski. What I love is that your work helps us reimagine joy, not really as a feeling that we have to conjure up, but more as a practice. There's just so much that's hard in the world, and yet to practice joy is so important, and you're really highlighting that in your work. I am curious, how did the younger version of you relate to joy, and what are the roots of why this became such an important topic for you personally to address?
I think 2 seasons stand out to me, one being most of my childhood and into my early 20s. I had a very performance-based identity. I only felt as good as my last performance. And so, therefore, I had a very performance based joy where I only gave myself permission to celebrate on the far side of a dream realized or a goal achieved. And I think that's how a lot of us view joy and celebration is we give ourselves permission to practice joy or to celebrate on the other side of some sort of change. We view it as a reaction versus a rhythm. And that was very much me. For the majority of my life, I only gave myself permission to celebrate, even the way God made me or a gift that I had on the far side of some sort of gold star. And sadly, that mostly worked for me for most of my life. I would please, perfect, perform the three Ps, and I mostly was able to find myself in a position where, for maybe a brief second, I felt that I had permission to celebrate. And of course, we know that's a mirage. As soon as you get there, the finish line has moved somewhere else, down the line. And so you're perpetually chasing, when will I be good enough? Or you're always afraid of falling off that pedestal, even if you do have that moment of, okay, I did it. And then this was a good thing, but a hard thing at the same time. I confronted a season that could largely be characterized by change and loss. It included a sudden move across the country that was good for me, but very much unwanted. I had to leave all those comforts that I had built my identity on. And so nobody knew who I was, where we were going. Nobody really was impressed by my accomplishments. And this was devastating to a girl who had a performance-based identity. But as you know, that's a gift because when you're left empty-handed, you're able to hold something that's more sure. Soon after we got here, my husband and I walked through a long season of infertility that included 5 miscarriages in about as many years, which was really painful for so many reasons. But one of the first times I was like, I can't outwork this. I can't be good enough. I can't outwork the pain to make it different. And that was heartbreaking on its own level, but also, again, there was an invitation in that to put my identity in who I was as a child of God, as Nicole versus what Nicole can do. And when I did start to encounter some breakthrough and good news in our story, I realized I was hesitant to embrace it. And this was so interesting to me because here is the thing I've longed for, the thing I've prayed for, and I am holding it at arm's length. I'm not celebrating it. And I was so grieved when I realized that, yeah, I've experienced a lot of tangible loss in my story, but a lot of the loss I've experienced has been my refusal to embrace the very good things that God had for me. And so that was the part 2 to your question of, the season that sort of shaped my relationship with joy is I was holding it at arm's length, and I learned that joy is actually the most vulnerable feeling we feel because when you hold something, it's automatically accompanied by the possibility of loss. And if you've been through trauma or pain of any kind, it can feel safer not to hold that joy at all than to hold something that might break. And again, I was so grieved by that, what I was missing out on. I thought, I don't want to miss out on my beautiful God-given life because I'm so busy preparing for the worst. And so I did a deep dive into the neuroscience research. I did a deep dive into scripture to understand, how can joy be a practice? My feelings are not there. How can I engage with this? What am I empowered to do to engage with this so that I can have a healthier relationship with joy? And then out of that came my book, What If It's Wonderful, and my Bible study, Daring Joy.
Okay, gosh, there's so much in there I want to unpack. So you had this self-awareness at a particular moment to recognize, okay, here's a moment where I should be feeling joy, and I am not. What was it that you were experiencing?
I think mostly fear. Yes, here's the thing I've prayed for, but it doesn't feel like a good idea to celebrate it. So I'm going to protect myself with pessimism and cynicism. which are just fancy forms of control, right? I'm trying to become invulnerable to that hope, to possibility.
It's so interesting to me from a parts framework through the lens of parts that it makes sense that a fearful part of you that had been very hurt was very present in your sort of inner family, and that to protect that part of you, an inner cynic or inner guarded part of you surfaced. And again, that you could become aware of that. I just get this sense listening to you that you're sort of became aware of that dissonance. Here I am not experiencing the relief or the joy or whatever. Joy is such a interesting emotion, what all goes into joy. And that you were honest enough to say, I see this. I can't conjure up that feeling. I can't make myself have it. So I have to go on a path of how do I learn? How do I teach myself how to celebrate, how to experience joy? Am I hearing you right? I mean, definitely you're in the right profession as a therapist, right? Where you're aware.
Yes.
But I love that. That's what's so beautiful. That's what you offer us, is you were so aware of the dissonance. But even in that awareness, you didn't immediately have the, oh, there, now I can. It's like, no, I have to go on a journey.
Yes. And I've learned, both as a person and a therapist, I think with a lot of the virtues we want to incorporate in our life, whether it's joy or courage, that we have to often act on what we know to be true or practice that virtue before the feelings follow. And in the brain research I've done and in my work with clients and in my own personal work, that's certainly been true for me, that I'm going to have to practice this before I necessarily feel it. And it might be quite a while of practicing it before those feelings follow. So that's absolutely the journey I took.
Okay, I want to get to the practice because I think it's so interesting and counterintuitive and in many ways countercultural to think about practicing joy. I think it's so important. I'm just so grateful that you're talking about it. Before we get there, when you set out on this path, this recognition of, I don't feel the way that I feel like I should feel about this, did you talk about that with people? And when you reached out for insight or wisdom, or even through your research, what did you find helpful? And what did you kind of bump up against that wasn't helpful out there on this quest?
I think one of the most unhelpful messages we can hear related to this quest, but also with joy is, and it's a similar but distinctly different message than the one that I would hope to share with people and that I would hope readers would get from my work, is this sort of just put a silver lining on the cloud or fake it till you make it. God doesn't ask us to call a painful thing good. Can good things grow from painful things? Of course. But he doesn't ask us to call that hardship or that hurt or that loss itself a good thing. And I think if we're not careful, we can easily kind of that toxic positivity kind of easily tie a bow on something where there's no bow to be tied, or look for a way to draw a silver lining on that cloud. And that's not what this is. I think one of the hardest but most helpful messages was understanding that joy is a practice, that it is a spiritual discipline. At first, I was annoyed when I started to see that message in scripture and the neuroscience research, because I thought, gosh, there's so many things in our personal growth, in our faith walk that require discipline. And I thought, gosh, can't joy just come easily? Can't that be the one thing that just flows naturally out of us? And then I realized how empowering that is. Because if joy were simply a feeling that came from good circumstances or came from the wins in our life, then it would be an experience for the lucky few who happen to enjoy good experiences sometimes or good circumstances. And to know that this is something that is actually available to us, to all of us in all seasons, was not only empowering, like, oh, I can actually take a step toward this and do something, but also really comforting that this is, and I could cry talking about this because for a long time I felt like I was somebody with my nose pressed against the glass, looking in on something I couldn't have. And I think a lot of us, when we think about joy and think about how I can feel that when, or if this relationship gets solved, or if I experience a health breakthrough, or whatever that is, we all have that thing, right? Then I can experience joy. I think a lot of us feel disqualified from it. And so my hope is that my work could be an encouragement that this is something that, yes, it might look different in different seasons. The feelings will go up and down, but this is something you're absolutely empowered to practice regardless of what your life might look like right now.
Yeah, I love that. I love that your work comes directly out of your own life experience. You said something that I think is really profound, that in many ways, joy can feel more vulnerable than grief. Why is that?
I was really surprised when I thought about it that way. And Brené Brown talks about the idea of foreboding joy, that joy is often accompanied by this sense of, but what if it all goes away? And I think a couple things, the act of holding something, right? When we embrace something, when we celebrate something, that's vulnerable because we're holding something that can be taken away, particularly if our joy is in something that comes and goes. And we can talk about that in a bit, but that can be a vulnerable experience to actually take a chance to celebrate something. You hear a lot about people saying, well, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, or, we operate with these really funny ideas about how life works, I think probably to try and get a sense of control on something that is uncertain. But just the idea, I've heard people say, yeah, things have been really great for a long time. I'm really enjoying my life and I'm in a sweet season of peace and connection with other people, so I'm probably due. We have this idea that we can only embrace that for so long. And just a side note on that, the research is really clear that while we might want to protect ourselves with pessimism and cynicism, even if, and this is a big if, because usually it doesn't happen, but even if that outcome that we fear should come to pass, or the other shoe does drop, having prepared for that mentally and emotionally doesn't take any of the sting out of that outcome, should that happen. So all we're doing is robbing ourselves of that delight and connection in the meantime.
These days, it can feel like there's a wellness trend for everything. Cold plunges, screen detoxes, gratitude rituals. I can feel so overwhelmed trying to sort through it all. What's actually helpful and what's just noise? In the midst of all that advice, sometimes the best thing you can do is talk to someone who's trained to help you, not a million people online. I know how valuable it is to have someone who's paying attention to your specific situation and needs. There's no such thing as one size fits all when it comes to healing. Therapy can give you real tools on how to set boundaries, how to navigate anxiety or burnout, and how to become more of who you're meant to be. And it's not just for crisis moments, it's for growth, healing, and living more fully. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/bestofyou. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/bestofyou. You know how every home has that one spot that feels like pure exhale? For me, that spot is my bed. And let's be honest, who tries to sneak into it the earliest? In my house, it's me. I'm the culprit, especially since I started using Cozy Earth. Their viscose from bamboo sheets and the cuddle blanket, game changers. I had one of those evenings recently where I just wanted to go to bed because everything just felt that refreshing. It's like your bed becomes a full body sigh of relief. Beyond the bedding, their women's cityscape cropped hoodie, the studio jogger, and their short sleeve stretch knit pajama set for summer are amazingly soft, flattering, and breathable. It's the kind of comfort that makes you feel pulled together and completely at ease. If you're on the fence, Cozy Earth has a 100-night sleep trial, so you can try it and see for yourself. And they back everything with a 10-year warranty because once you try it, you'll want it to last forever. Head to CozyEarth.com and use my code BESTOFYOU for 40% off. And if you get a post-purchase survey, make sure to let them know you heard about Cozy Earth right here at The Best of You. Because your bed should be more than a place to sleep. It should be your happy place. Cozy Earth makes that possible. I hear very clearly in what you're saying, Nicole, that living in the moment, what is mine today is mine today. And the joy that I have today is the joy that I have today, and not worrying about tomorrow. And this sounds cliche, which is so hard about this conversation, right? It's so nuanced. There's a lot about it in the Bible. We see it in psychology, being in the present moment, what's happening right now. We don't do ourselves any favors with the sort of doom stressing, the doom worrying. And I love that you underscored that. But again, that is a practice. And I hear you saying that a part of you had to retrain, reorient to a different practice, which required you to be vulnerable to a new emotion. I guess how you say it is we don't drift toward joy. And so in your own experience, you had to begin hunting for it, looking for it. So talk to us a little bit about, as you're realizing, oh, I need to incorporate this practice into my life. What were some of the first steps you started taking, and how did that go, and how did that feel for you initially?
Clunky. I think when you're learning anything for the first time and you're carving those new neural pathways in your brain, it's like blazing a trail in the forest versus taking the well-beaten path. The brain prefers what it knows, not necessarily what is good or true. And I say that not for someone to feel overwhelmed by change, but to validate that change is hard. Carving those neural pathways is uncomfortable for your brain, even if it's good and ultimately healthier thing. So it definitely felt clunky, but rewarding nonetheless. I think when I started to understand what some of those practices were, and we can talk about what those were and how to practice them at home if you're listening. But yeah, it felt clunky. It felt unfamiliar. And while I was helping that truth become more familiar to my brain. But again, hopeful, and I really believed in what I was being led to do.
And also, as both yourself and as a therapist, it would strike me that you have to have some buy-in to recognize this is a path I need to work on, right? And I think that could be confusing. And even as a clinician, right, we have some people who come to see us that are so good at bright-siding things, which isn't what you're talking about. That's not joy. That there is actually a need to help them really walk through and feel what's hard, almost a practice of grieving in a way. And I get this sense you were really aware. I see something happening here that I need to shift inside of me to be able to balance out. There's a part of me, if I think about that part's language, that is maybe always to some degree going to be a little bit uncertain. Maybe a little bit like, I'm not that one that just dives right into the excitement and the exuberance of emotion. And also, I need to cultivate this other part of me that can feel and lean into the joy and lean into this is good and I'm going to let myself, right? So that takes a lot of self-awareness and self-knowledge. And I'm thinking of the listener, how might they know that there's an invitation also to joy, and that also might be a practice not to deny what's been hard, not to bypass what's been hard. And I think, again, I'm being long-winded here, but I think especially in faith contexts where joy can become a way to spiritually bypass, I should feel this way. I shouldn't feel sad. I shouldn't feel angry. I shouldn't feel ungrateful. For a lot of folks, I could imagine there's a sort of, well, which one is it? And I'm trying to figure out how to learn to feel angry. I'm trying to figure out how to learn to feel sad. I hear very clearly in what you're saying, Nicole, that we want to make sure there is also a seat for joy at the table. Joy also needs to be there. So how do we know when there's that invitation? How do we know maybe there's an out of balance? And maybe the best metaphor I can think of is it's almost the opposite of what happened in the first Inside Out movie, right? In the first Inside Out movie, Joy was the only character. She was dominating. But for you, and I think for a lot of people, Joy's the one that's marginalized. Joy's the one that's being held back. So both as a clinician and in your own personal life, how do we know when that invitation might be there?
That's such a good question. I think, similar ideas, different language. I work with a model called restoration therapy. And the first thing we do, and something that I'm very aware of as somebody who practices it in my own life, is to understand what that message of pain is. So what are the feelings you tend to feel when you're in a painful situation? And these are shaped by our stories. So you and I could go through the exact same thing tomorrow, and I might feel inadequate or worthless, and you might feel alone or unsafe, just as an example. But understanding what those messages are, I'm very clear on what my 3 to 4 feelings I tend to feel 90% of the time I'm in a painful situation. And so understanding, like for me, what those wounds are, I've already shared, a part of my story would be definitely not good enough. That's a big one for me, shaped by my miscarriage and infertility season, might also be vulnerable. And so then it's identifying what are the ways I tend to protect myself and react to that pain that are totally understandable and probably served me at one point in my life as a child, but are no longer serving me now, at least to let run amok. So, and the 4 broad categories of those behaviors are shaming yourself, blaming other people, controlling, and escaping. And this is what you were talking about earlier, is sometimes we've got to know what names to give our pain. We've got to name the cost. We've got to grieve what that feeling is, identify what we might be tempted to do. I am a world-class controller, and that can look a lot of different ways, not necessarily micromanaging someone else. But for me, as I've already shared, becoming invulnerable to that pain. So if I just expect the worst, then I won't have to feel as devastated, or I won't feel the gravity of that vulnerability if it doesn't turn out how I'm hoping and praying it will. And so really being able to name that is where you can see some invitation of what does it look like? And again, that's a well-carved neural pathway in my brain. But what is the truth that I want to claim? And I use that word claim because, again, this doesn't mean the feeling isn't real and that I don't have good reasons for feeling that way. But as an empowered adult, that's the feeling that's being thrown down. What am I going to choose to pick up and continue to tell myself? What am I going to choose to speak to that very real feeling? And how can I practice acting on what I know to be true instead of reacting to how I feel, which for me is engaging in a lot of these joy practices, because that's counter to how I tend to react and protect myself.
Yeah, it makes sense what you're saying. So I think for me, not with how I am as a clinician, but with myself, when I feel one of those vulnerable, painful emotions, I tend to bright side. I tend to minimize, it'll be fine. And that's not joy, but it can appear that way. It can appear like a positive, optimistic person. And this conversation is so interesting to me because I had this conversation with my co-author, Kimberly Miller, when we were writing Boundaries for Your Soul. At the time, I was practicing letting myself feel sadness. And so I would listen to sad music. Like I would listen to that Coldplay song, Fix You.
Yes. Good choice.
And both Kim and then my husband too, they're like, why are you listening to that? Like, they didn't need the help.
Right.
They didn't need the help to feel that. And I think you're saying something interesting. The impetus is still, whether you're going to pessimism or whether you're kind of going to a bright-siding part of myself, either way, we're not dealing with the actual vulnerable feeling, which is something hard happened, something painful. We're not actually telling ourselves the truth. Whether we're piling on and saying nothing good is ever going to happen for me or expect no good in the future, or whether we're saying it'll be fine, don't worry about it, just shrug it off. We're not giving ourselves the actual healing and truth that true joy or any of the fruit of the Spirit, but in this case, joy. So tell me, in light of that, kind of isolating what we're talking about, something that is healing, something that is, for example, again, using IFS vernacular, playfulness is a quality of the Spirit-led self. Playfulness, which I think is akin to joy, is the ability when something really hard is happening, and I have a couple of friends who are really good at this, and they just make you laugh. But it's not because they're bypassing the pain. It's because you just see the absurdity in it. And you're just like, tears are streaming down your face and you're kind of laugh crying. That to me is joy. It's not bypassing. And so I'm curious, in your vernacular that you're bringing through restoration therapy, what is joy? Like, what is it actually? It's not bright siding, but I hear you saying it's also very much not kind of the opposite of that, which is the pessimistic or the cynical component. How do you know it when you see it? How do you know it when you feel it? What's your experience of that?
Well, I do have a definition that I personally hold, but I think to speak specifically to what you're saying is I'm often asked, what's the difference between celebration and escape? Because I think we do tend to look at joy as falsely, as you're pointing out, bright-siding. And so you're exactly right. Bright-siding or getting pessimistic or doing any of those four things, blame, shame, control, escape, are different forms of reacting to our pain. So they might have different consequences, but they're equally unhelpful and unhealthy and don't actually help us deal with that pain. And so I would ask, somebody that maybe is having a hard time discerning the difference is, what are you looking for? Any sort of escape behavior, including bright-siding, is looking to take us out. So there's nothing I can do to solve this pain or deal with this pain. So I'm just going to check out and hope it goes away while I'm gone. Versus joy and celebration keeps us connected. It's an avenue of connection with our emotion and with other people and with God. So, the example you gave of your friends just having the gift of seeing the absurdity in something, they're not disconnecting from their pain and numbing it. They're relationally connecting in it. So one diagnostic question is this disconnecting or is it connecting? Is this connecting me to God, to other people in my life, to my emotional experience? Or is it something that's just hitting the pause button on my emotional processing? It's like when you take a nap and it feels so good to fall asleep because you don't have to think about that thing that's burdening you. And then you wake up and it takes about 5 seconds for you to be like, oh, there it is. That's escape versus what's helping me emotionally process this, what's helping me connect to other people. So yes, and the very simple, from a spiritual perspective, definition of joy that I've landed on is recalling God's steadfast character and remembering his faithfulness in our story. That's joy that's available to all of us in all seasons. So at the very root, from a spiritual perspective, that's the definition I personally hold on to as something that's available to me always.
I love this. You're speaking about it with such depth. There's such a deep integrated understanding there. I love this quote you say, Nicole. I love celebrating with God instead of seeing celebration as merely the result of the struggles God has carried me through. And I think there's something to that, the relational connected component that you're getting at there. When you're with God through it all, there's a withness in the joy, not God, thanks for rescuing me from this hard thing, as if you weren't in the hard thing with me too. But there's oh my gosh, God, look at what's happening. This is good news. We're doing it. There's that withness that's so beautiful. I didn't even realize I was clenching my jaw at night until my dentist gently mentioned you're grinding your teeth. It was frustrating because I didn't want to spend hundreds of dollars, but I also didn't want to ignore it. If you're part of the 30% of Americans who grind their teeth, your smile needs protection, and Remy's custom fit night guard is the best solution I've found. Remy sent me an impression kit right to my door with super clear instructions. I did my molds in minutes and sent them back. A few days later, my custom fit night guard made right here in the US arrived, and I've been using it ever since. It fits perfectly, it's comfortable, and I can already feel the difference in my jaw. Remy offers a 45-night perfect fit guarantee or your money back, so you truly have nothing to lose. No waiting rooms, no overpriced bills, just a better way to protect your teeth while you sleep. Try Remy risk-free at shopremy.com/bestofyou and use code bestofyou at checkout for up to 50% off. That's shopremi.com/bestofyou with code bestofyou.
The story that really stood out to me, teaching me that particular point, was the story of the 10 men with leprosy. And if you're not familiar with that story, briefly, you can find it in Luke 17. But 10 men have leprosy, and it's their disease that's brought them together, because that would have been the thing in that culture that defined them more than anything else. More than their personality, they would have been isolated from their families, isolated from their communities. And so these 10 men have nothing to lose, because it's not only a physical disease, it's an emotional and relational cost as well. They see Jesus and they cry out for healing. And he tells them, be on your way to the temple, which might sound like a strange response, but it's typically the first step one took after being healed. So they had to exercise some faith that they would be healed on their way to the temple. And sure enough, they start to see their own healing in the faces and bodies of their friends. And we can assume that, given the massive life change that this would have meant, that they all felt grateful. But only one, we're told in scripture, returned to actually thank Jesus. And I looked at this story and trying to understand the difference between gratitude and thanksgiving, because thanksgiving is the outward expression of the gratitude that we feel. And I love Jesus's response. It's a bit facetious when this one man comes to say thank you. He says, well, weren't all 10 healed? And, it's easy to maybe take this as Jesus's bid for our praise, but that's not the point of this story. The point of this story is that thanksgiving, saying our gratitude out loud, either to God in our prayers or to somebody else in your life, is the avenue we've been given to celebrate the gift with the giver. So if you're a person of faith, Thanksgiving is the avenue we've been given to celebrate with God. Like, look what's happening. This is awesome. I think often I was used to clinging to God, over ground that was rough underfoot, and then pictured him saying, okay, have fun. Let me know when you need me again, when we got to that ground that was smoother. And he absolutely wants to engage with us in the light of our joy, just as he wants to be present with us in our pain. And Thanksgiving is a helpful practice for many reasons, but it is the avenue we've been given to actually celebrate God's good.
I love that. Whether with God or with other people as well, celebrating with a friend. I'm so excited about this. And we give someone else a gift. If I've walked through painful times with a friend and then something really great happens, what a gift that I also get to be part of that experience. You're so wise on that. There's a relational component to it.
I heard a gentleman talking about, how we often talk about that best friend as the one you could call in the middle of the night with your deepest hurt, your deepest need, when you're in your darkest hour. And he was saying, we don't often talk about the even more vulnerable close friend that you could call when you have something to celebrate and who you know is not going to be threatened by that, going to rejoice with you in that. Because there's vulnerability in that. Calling somebody to say, I need to celebrate this with you. This breakthrough just happened, or I'm so excited about this. And you're the person I thought to call, in addition to celebrating other people. But I thought that was so rich and so good to point out.
Oh, that's so good. That hit. Yeah. Who's that person that you can call? That's a great insight. Nicole, what are some practices that have helped you personally and that you use with clients stay attuned to joy? So, whether as a therapist, as a mom, as a person of faith, what are some practices that help you keep this part of you or stay attuned to this idea of joy that we're talking about?
Yeah, and there's tons in the book and the Bible study if you're curious about what do I actually do. But there's a few favorites. Thanksgiving would be one. And again, that's the outward expression of the gratitude that we feel in our hearts. So I live in the greater New York City area, and all over the New York City subway system are signs, if you see something, say something. And it has a much more ominous meaning there. But I've adopted and tweaked that phrase as if I feel something, say something. And I use that to challenge myself toward this notion of saying what I'm grateful for out loud. Again, either to God in your prayers or to someone in your life. And it is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to look somebody in the eye and say, hey, I just want you to know this is the difference that your friendship has made in my life. This is how I've grown because of our relationship. We don't talk like that in everyday life. But it is so powerful. Not only will you increase your joy, because the research says that you will experience much more joy when you actually share your gratitude out loud through Thanksgiving than had you simply written it down and kept it to yourself. So you'll increase your own joy, but hopefully you'll also pass some joy on to the recipient of that news. Savoring, you mentioned being in the present moment. And you and I, as clinicians, both know that when we are anxious, our brain tends to run ahead to the future and think about all the what ifs, or it runs to the past and thinks about all the woulda, coulda, shoulda, we should have done differently. The problem is we're not empowered in the future or the past to make choices. We only have today. And so savoring as a practice that's both helpful for anxiety and for increasing our joy. And the way that you practice it is you take one snapshot, not a whole dinner party, maybe the look on your friend's face when you gave them a compliment across the table, or the sound of another friend's laugh, or, something you could take a photograph with your brain. And you simply ask your 5 traditional senses what they're going to remember about that moment. So what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? And what do you feel? And what this does is it extracts more joy from the life that you're already living. So again, we tend to think of celebration. I've got to add something to my life, or I've got to spend a lot of money or a lot of time. And this is about experiencing more joy in your everyday, the life you already have. So you don't need to add anything. It's just experiencing more joy in what you've already got. Also, we don't drift toward joy. Our brains are a little bit like Velcro with negativity and Teflon with joyful things. So this is a way of retraining our brain to not only recognize joy that our brain would typically dismiss, but also helping that joy be stickier. And you're telling your brain, this is something that you would normally think is not important, but we actually need to keep this. And we're going to store it in a part of our brain where we can actually recall it later as a fond memory. And it's not just discarded as something that we don't need anymore. So it's part of how we retrain our brain toward joy. And when you practice this daily, you'll start to see more and more opportunities. My clients and readers will often tell me, first it was a challenge to do one thing a day. And then it's like, oh, it's hard to pick one because I keep seeing opportunities to savor and extract joy from that moment. So those are two really powerful practices that are easy to incorporate daily that I would encourage listeners to start with.
I love that because it gets to your point of regardless of your circumstances, not to quote Paul, but regardless of our circumstances, that's getting at, even when things are really hard, I can look for those moments to savor. There's an attunement that's intentional. And I love how you're kind of guiding us through how to practice noticing it, but then really pulling all of that into our muscle memory. It's beautiful. So, what would you say to a listener right now who's in a hard season? Maybe they're afraid to dream, afraid to celebrate, afraid of what could go wrong. What's one piece of wisdom that you'd summarize to say to them right now?
Well, I'll go based on the research that with that particular feeling, that foreboding joy, if you're holding something but you're afraid to dream or afraid to hope, thanksgiving for what the research says is the only way to tolerate that vulnerability of joy. So if you're celebrating something but you're afraid it'll go away, or maybe there's a possibility of something on the horizon but you're afraid to hope, thanksgiving for where you are right now is what the research says is the practice that's going to serve you best. And then I'll go back to my joy definition that is available to all of us, because that's what we see certainly in the Old Testament. As we look at the Old Testament, that the Israelites, their celebration wasn't necessarily, knowing how difficult their story was at many points, wasn't necessarily in reaction to something good happening, but it was remembering God's character and remembering his faithfulness. And so making celebration a rhythm versus a reaction in your family culture and in your own personal life, I think is a really helpful place to start as well.
I love that. Like you said, there's that foreboding fear that's future oriented. We have to turn to today. What am I grateful for right now? What is good right now? What can I celebrate right now? That's awesome. Tell us, Nicole, about how my listeners can find you, and especially about this newest project, Daring Joy, which sounds like it's a very practical and biblically based way for folks who are wanting to incorporate more of what you've been talking about into their lives.
Sure. So my website is a great place to connect with me, Nicole Zasowski, ZASOWSKI.com. You can buy my book, What If It's Wonderful, or Daring Joy, certainly on Amazon or everywhere you like to buy books. There's information on that on my website as well. And Daring Joy, I felt like when I finished What If It's Wonderful, they're not companion projects, so you don't need to read them in order or anything like that. And the content is largely different. But I felt like I wasn't done with the topic. I just had this sense that we were going to keep going in this conversation. And that's where Daring Joy was born. It goes through the stories of 6 different women in the Bible. And these women either hold up the mirror to what holds us back from joy, or provide a beautiful example of what it actually looks like to practice joy when life doesn't necessarily serve that up. And I learned so much as I studied their stories. It's amazing how age-old these struggles that we've been talking about in this conversation are. And because you see it right from the beginning with Eve. The women are Eve, Sarah, Miriam, Mary, mother of Jesus, Elizabeth, and Mary Magdalene, if you're interested in that. And it's a more of a interactive workbook style resource, whereas What If It's Wonderful is a traditional trade book, but it does have discussion questions in the back if you're looking for a book club discussion guide or anything like that.
I think it's great. I highly recommend. And again, as therapists, right, we are so often helping people work through their pain and their trauma. And it is so amazing to me and beautiful that as a therapist, you're bringing in the fullness of what healing is, because this is a huge component of it. No matter how hard things are, this is a component of wholeness. And I love that you're bringing it in with that nuance of understanding. You're not trying to bypass, but I just highly recommend to anyone listening, to the therapist listening, and all of you listening, these are great resources so that we don't lose sight of the goodness and the beauty and the joy. And I just am so grateful for what you're doing.
Thank you. You know that I love your work and so appreciate you as well. So this was a lovely conversation for me to have as well.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of The Best of You. It would mean so much if you take a moment to subscribe. You can go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts and click the plus or follow button. That will ensure you don't miss an episode and it helps get the word out to others. While you're there, I'd love it if you leave your 5-star review. I look forward to seeing you back here next Thursday. And remember, as you become the best of who you are, you honor God, you heal others, and you stay true to your God-given self.
Want to live better?
We've got a lot of work to do.
Join Chris Hemsworth in National Geographic's new Disney Plus original series, Limitless. Live better now.
I'm diving headfirst into cutting-edge science to uncover 3 powerful secrets to living better right now. The growth that occurs through any challenging experience is really what we seek.
Chris Hemsworth stars in Limitless. Live better now. Now streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu.
It's showtime.